Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: a mother in Ouagadougou standing in line for hours clutching a small sack of imported rice from Asia, wondering if she can afford another bag tomorrow. For decades, this has been the silent story of Burkina Faso families depending on foreign ships and warehouses thousands of miles away just to eat. John F. Kennedy once warned in 1960, a society whose young men and women are in a constant state of slumber will never realize our potential. Today, that warning echoes louder than ever across the Sahel, because the question is no longer whether our people are asleep, but whether they are finally beginning to wake up. And then out of nowhere, a revelation in the small commune of Kamsila at Bassa-Mayam. A Burkinabè woman long known for her wealth but never for politics has just unveiled Africa's largest rice processing plant. Not the government, not an international NGO, not a foreign investor. A single private citizen. A factory so vast, so advanced, that it can process 400 tons of rice every single day, enough to flip the country's destiny upside down. Even President Ibrahim Traoré, who has built his leadership on the dream of food sovereignty, was caught off guard. Could this be the miracle that ends Burkina Faso's dependence on imports and turns the nation into a regional rice exporter? This is not just a story about machines and grain. It is a story about dignity, about whether one act of vision can spark an awakening for an entire continent. So, stay with us as we uncover how a hidden giant in the fields of Kadogo may be rewriting Africa's food future. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Do you believe that Africa is finally ready to break free from rice imports? Should more African billionaires invest at home rather than abroad? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, hit subscribe and join us in this journey. The story did not begin with speeches at the presidential palace or announcements from a government ministry. It began quietly, almost humbly, in the commune of Kamsila at Bassa-Mayam. What was revealed there stunned not only citizens, but also political leaders across Burkina Faso. A female billionaire admired for her fortune, but never before seen as a political actor, had just unveiled Africa's largest rice processing plant. At first glance, the news seemed almost unbelievable. Could a landlocked country, often portrayed as fragile and dependent, really host such a colossal facility? But when journalists and government ministers arrived at the site, the scale was undeniable. A plant capable of processing 400 tons of rice per day, an output so massive that it dwarfs existing mills across the continent. This was not just another industrial site, it was a national game changer. For years, Burkina Faso has been chained to a cycle of dependence. Despite fertile land and hardworking farmers, the country spent millions annually importing rice from Asia. Ships unloaded bags at foreign ports, middlemen raised prices, and ordinary families bore the burden. Domestic harvests often rotted or were sold cheaply because local infrastructure could not match international standards. Farmers labored, but hope was thin. The Kadogo plant threatens to overturn that equation entirely. Its technology integrates every stage of production, from raw grain to polished market-ready rice under one roof. Trucks now deliver freshly harvested rice to intake bays where dust, stones, and impurities are swiftly removed. Conveyor belts feed the cleaned grains into high-capacity washing units, scrubbing away husks and dirt, ensuring hygiene and consistency. Next, polishing machines transform the grains into gleaming uniform kernels, precisely the quality that has long been missing in African rice when compared to imports. The heart of the plant lies in its milling halls, where automated systems separate broken grains from intact kernels with near-surgical precision. Instead of being wasted, broken rice is packaged separately for markets that demand it, while whole grains are sorted, branded, and prepared for export. Packaging too signals a revolution. Gone are the days of rough sacks tied with rope. Rice from Kadogo now leaves in sealed printed bags carrying a Burkinabè identity, premium quality proudly made in Burkina Faso. Efficiency was not an afterthought, but a design principle. Energy-saving systems reduce power consumption, while airtight silos and temperature-controlled storage eliminate post-harvest losses that once drained farmers' livelihoods. For the first time, growers can plant with confidence that their crops will not rot before reaching markets. The symbolism of such a facility cannot be overstated. It did not come from foreign aid or IMF loans. It came from within a Burkinabè woman choosing to invest not in luxury real estate abroad, but in the soil of her own country. In a time when sovereignty is often spoken of as an abstract dream, the Kadogo plant makes it tangible. Steel, grain, and machinery now embody the very concept of independence. Even President Ibrahim Traoré, whose speeches have consistently centered on food sovereignty, was reportedly surprised by the audacity of the project. Ministers who toured the site called it a revolution hidden in plain sight. Citizens spread the news across radio stations, social media feeds, and market whispers. In Ouagadougou, young vendors spoke of the possibility that their nation could finally export rice. In Bobo Dioulasso, farmers imagined their harvests transformed into steady income. In Kaya and Koudagou, women's groups asked how many jobs might now be available for their communities. The unveiling of the Kadogo plant is more than a business success. It is a declaration that Burkina Faso refuses to be defined by scarcity. It is a blueprint showing that one bold act of private vision can stand shoulder to shoulder with national policy. And it has opened a door to a new question that stirs the entire nation. If a single factory can do this, what could happen if the whole country moved with the same determination? The shockwaves from Kadogo spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours of the announcement, radio stations were buzzing with interviews, social media was flooded with photos, and markets across Burkina Faso were alive with whispers. For ordinary citizens, this was not just an industrial development, it was a collective awakening. The idea that their nation, long reliant on foreign rice imports, might soon stand as an exporter lit a fire of pride. In Ouagadougou, young vendors who usually sold bags stamped with foreign brands began to imagine a future where they might proudly sell rice labeled "Made in Burkina Faso." Can you believe it? One stallholder was overheard telling a customer, "Our own rice polished and packed like the imports." No more leftovers from Asia. The air in the capital carried not just curiosity, but hope. In Bobo Dioulasso, groups of farmers gathered under neem trees to listen as local leaders explained the scale of the project. For men and women who had spent their lives bent over rice fields battling drought pests and fluctuating prices, the news felt like liberation. For the first time, they had the promise of a guaranteed buyer contracts with the factory itself. No more begging middlemen, an elder farmer said, his eyes bright. Now we harvest, and we know it will reach the market. The reaction among women was perhaps the most striking. Traditionally pushed to the margins of agriculture, working long hours without land titles credit or fair prices, they suddenly found themselves recognized as central actors in the new supply chain. Women's cooperatives began negotiating directly with the factory, ensuring their rice would be processed and branded as premium Burkinabè produce. Beyond farming, the plant also opened jobs in packaging, logistics, and administration roles, often assigned to women for their precision and care. For many, this marked the first time they would step into formal salaried work with benefits. As one young mother from Kaya put it, "It is not just rice, it is respect." The youth, too, found a new horizon. For years, unemployment had forced thousands to leave Burkina Faso in search of uncertain futures abroad. Suddenly, Kadogo offered an alternative, training workshops for technicians' jobs as drivers, warehouse managers, machine operators. Others saw opportunities sprouting around the industrial hub, restaurants, shops, and transport businesses feeding off the plant's activity. The shift was not only economic, but cultural. Farming, long dismissed as backbreaking and unrewarding, was being rebranded as a dignified career connected to modern industry. If our rice can be exported like oil or gold, a student in Ouagadougou said, then why shouldn't I study agriculture? Beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, the reaction was equally intense. Investors in West Africa, from Lagos to Accra, began asking how a landlocked country with limited infrastructure had managed to host the largest rice plant on the continent. Diplomats in Ouagadougou quietly admitted that this was a symbolic victory, an unexpected demonstration that Burkina Faso could chart its own path toward sovereignty. In international media, headlines shifted from stories of insecurity and coups to those of innovation and industry. Even in capitals like Washington, Paris, and Brussels, the Kadogo announcement raised uncomfortable questions. For years, the dominant narrative portrayed Burkina Faso as fragile and dependent a nation that required Western loans and aid to survive. Now, a single private initiative had proven otherwise. Without IMF conditionalities or World Bank oversight, Burkina Faso had produced a facility that not only matched but exceeded global standards. It was a direct challenge to the assumption that Africa's progress must be externally guided, and yet the most powerful reactions came from within. Ministers who toured the plant returned visibly shaken, describing it as a revolution hidden in plain sight. Citizens across towns and villages began framing it as proof that change was possible from the ground up. The phrase sovereignty in steel began to circulate, a recognition that the factory embodied the political message President Ibrahim Traoré had long been preaching. The crescendo of reactions, farmers seeing stability, women gaining empowerment, youth envisioning futures at home, and the international community recalibrating its image of Burkina Faso marked the high point of the story. The Kadogo plant was no longer just a factory. It had become a symbol, a rallying cry, and perhaps even the spark of a continental food revolution. The unveiling of the Kadogo rice plant was not only an industrial milestone, it was a turning point that began reshaping the very fabric of Burkinabè society. The consequences, civil, social, and political, were immediate and profound. On the economic front, the most visible change came to the farmers. For decades, their work had been a gamble. They planted rice with hope, but too often it spoiled before reaching buyers, or middlemen purchased it at humiliatingly low prices. The factory altered that equation overnight. With contracts signed directly between cooperatives and the plant growers, finally had a guaranteed market. Farming shifted from a seasonal gamble to a sustainable profession. Suddenly, a farmer could plan beyond one harvest, deciding how much land to cultivate, how many workers to employ, even how much credit to secure for fertilizer and seeds. Stability replaced uncertainty. The social effects spread quickly. Families that once struggled to keep children in school began to afford tuition fees. Clinics reported improvements in nutrition as households could purchase a wider variety of food. Local markets came alive with renewed activity as farmers spent more freely building new homes, repairing old ones, and investing in small businesses. What began as an industrial project was weaving itself into the social fabric of the nation. For women, the consequences were transformative. Long marginalized in agriculture, they suddenly found themselves central to a new economic model. Women's cooperatives became formal partners in the rice supply chain. Their produce, once lost in anonymous bags sold at unfair prices, now re-emerged in international-grade packaging stamped with Burkinabè pride. Employment opportunities within the plant itself, quality control, packaging, logistics, gave many women their first taste of salaried work with benefits. This economic power quietly shifted household dynamics, offering dignity and autonomy where before there had been exclusion. Sovereignty, once framed only as national, was now being lived at a personal level. Youth, too, began to see a new horizon. With unemployment pushing many to seek futures abroad, the factory offered training programs and stable jobs. Some became machine operators or warehouse managers. Others found indirect work in transport, catering, or small businesses surrounding the industrial hub. For a generation raised under the shadow of instability, Kadogo offered a new story. Progress was possible at home. Farming was no longer a trap. It was a career tied to modern industry and pride. Politically, the ripple effects were undeniable. President Ibrahim Traoré had long spoken of sovereignty as the cornerstone of Burkina Faso's future, particularly food sovereignty. Critics accused him of speaking in slogans without proof. But the Kadogo plant transformed his words into physical reality. Even though the facility was privately funded, it aligned perfectly with his political vision. Citizens saw the project not as separate from government rhetoric, but as evidence that Traoré's message was working, that sovereignty could indeed change daily life. This posed challenges as well as opportunities. The government now had to integrate the plant into its broader food strategy without appearing to lean too heavily on private wealth. Still, the political dividends were clear. Opposition voices had less ground to argue that the sovereignty agenda was hollow. Supporters, meanwhile, framed the project as proof that the vision was so powerful it inspired citizens to act boldly on their own. Regionally, the plant reinforced Burkina Faso's standing within the Alliance of Sahel States. In a period when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are defying foreign pressure, every demonstration of self-reliance carries symbolic weight. Kadogo became evidence that development could be achieved without IMF loans or Western aid packages. Diplomats acknowledged it as a quiet but decisive victory in the broader contest over Africa's future. In the end, the Kadogo plant's civil and political consequences converge on one central truth: sovereignty is no longer an idea confined to speeches. It is being lived in villages, households, and marketplaces across Burkina Faso. And that reality strengthens not only the people, but also the leader who promised them that a new era was possible. The Kadogo rice plant did more than astonish citizens at home. It forced the world to take notice. For the first time, headlines about Burkina Faso were not about insecurity, coups, or instability, but about innovation, industrial strength, and a surprising model of sovereignty. That shift in narrative carries enormous weight on the international stage. Across West Africa, the news spread like wildfire. Nigeria, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal, all of which spend billions annually importing rice, were compelled to ask themselves why Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation with fewer resources, had taken the lead. In policy circles from Lagos to Accra, analysts began to describe Kadogo not merely as a Burkinabè triumph, but as a continental proof of concept. If a single facility could transform dependency into self-reliance, why couldn't similar plants rise in cocoa fields of Côte d'Ivoire, the peanut farms of Senegal, or the maize belts of Tanzania? The plant ignited a vision of regional integration, where African nations trade among themselves instead of draining wealth to Asia and Europe. In Western capitals, the reaction was far more cautious. For decades, the accepted narrative was that fragile African economies could not modernize without international loans, aid packages, or technical oversight from the IMF and World Bank. The Kadogo plant shatters that assumption. It was financed by African capital, engineered with African talent, and unveiled without a single foreign donor logo at its gates. This independence complicates Washington's and Brussels' policy playbooks, which have long relied on financial leverage to shape African decision-making. Some Western analysts now warn that such projects, if replicated, could reduce demand for imported rice from Asia and disrupt global commodity flows. Others frame it as a political threat, a visible symbol that African nations can succeed outside the orbit of Western financial institutions. For governments accustomed to seeing Burkina Faso as a dependent partner, the Kadogo project represents a challenge to the status quo. By contrast, in Moscow and Beijing, the announcement was welcomed as validation. Russian and Chinese media outlets quickly highlighted Kadogo as evidence that Africa can industrialize on its own terms, free from Western tutelage. For them, the plant reinforces the broader geopolitical argument that multipolarity, multiple centers of global power, is not only desirable, but inevitable. In this light, Burkina Faso is no longer a small Sahelian state, but a frontline example of what sovereignty looks like in practice. Beyond geopolitics, the cultural symbolism also struck a chord. The fact that the project was led by a woman billionaire reframed global perceptions about power, gender, and leadership in Africa. In development conferences and think tanks, Kadogo is already being discussed as a case study that challenges stereotypes. Instead of images of crisis, Burkina Faso now exports an image of possibility of women and youth driving industrial transformation. For the United States in particular, the challenge is strategic. Washington has positioned itself as a defender of democracy and development in Africa, often warning against military-led governments like that of Ibrahim Traoré. But Kadogo complicates that narrative. The plant provides tangible proof that progress can occur under a model not sanctioned by the West. For many Africans watching from outside, the message is clear: sovereignty is not just political rhetoric. It can take the shape of silos, conveyor belts, and 400 tons of rice a day. The global lesson is simple yet profound. If Burkina Faso, a nation often dismissed as fragile, can host Africa's largest rice facility, then no African country is too small, too poor, or too unstable to dream of independence. The question now belongs to the rest of the continent and to the world: will Kadogo remain an isolated triumph, or will it spark a continental revolution in how Africa feeds itself? The story of the Kadogo rice plant is more than an industrial achievement. It is a warning, a reminder, and a call to action. For decades, Africa has been trapped in a cycle of dependency, borrowing money, importing food, and waiting for outside solutions. Kadogo proves that this cycle can be broken. Yet, it also raises a sobering truth: one factory, no matter how massive, cannot carry an entire nation on its shoulders. If the momentum stops here, the dream of sovereignty will fade back into rhetoric. This is where the challenge begins. Will Burkina Faso's leaders integrate the plant into a national food strategy that benefits all citizens? Will African billionaires follow the example of this one woman and invest at home rather than abroad? Or will Kadogo remain a lonely beacon, admired but not replicated? The answer will determine whether Africa continues to spend billions on foreign rice or finally turns its fertile land into engines of independence. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the stakes are just as high. His legitimacy rests on proving that sovereignty is more than a slogan. The Kadogo project has gifted him tangible proof, but now he must show that this success can scale, that his vision can rally the nation, not just private investors. Do you think President Traoré's strategies for national reform are truly effective, or should Africa prepare for new leaders to take the mantle? And for the world, especially the United States and Europe, Kadogo is a signal that the old order is slipping. No longer can Africa be treated as a continent of receivers. It is becoming a continent of creators. That shift, if multiplied, will reshape global trade politics and perception. So I leave you with these questions. Do you believe Africa is finally ready to break free from rice imports? Should more leaders and investors take bold steps like this? And can sovereignty be built one factory at a time, or does it demand a continental movement? If you feel proud to be among the first to witness and support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision, please share this video. And if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, subscribe and join us, because this is only the beginning of Africa's story.